What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Observatory. I'm Kyle. Today I'm chatting with Justin Berka about building and managing analytics teams. So Justin moved into data engineering originally from a background in econometrics, and he went on to lead the analytics teams at companies you've heard of like Uber and Intercom, as well as been doing some angel investing in a number of data tooling companies. He now leads data at Nearside, which is a banking platform designed for small businesses. Justin, welcome to the Observatory.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Well, let's just dive right into some fun questions here. So we're getting advice today on building and managing analytics teams. So maybe you could start with some advice from you. What have you learned over the last decade of building those teams that you think that a newer data team leader would benefit from knowing?
When you say decade like that, I feel really old, but hopefully have picked up some useful things along the way. For me, I think there's a few categories of things. One of the big ones for me is aligning the data team with the business and aligning the data team with business impact specifically. I joke with people on my team now that if you had a Justin bingo card, all of the squares are basically business impact. I think a lot of times you see data teams that are siloed in different parts of the organization or structured differently. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later probably, but I think it's really important to align the work that the data team is doing with that business impact, right? And that's not to say necessarily everything that the data team is doing, you have to be able to put an exact revenue number to. Because of the way data teams work in such a matrixed fashion, I don't think that necessarily happens. But I think it's important to be aligned with what are the top level goals of the company and how can the data team help that, rather than just falling into sometimes the pattern that you see where data teams end up doing a lot of very rote work that has very different levels of ROI. So business impact, certainly one of them that I think is important. I think the other one that I didn't used to think about, I find much more important now, is picking a few things and doing them well. I think particularly when you're a data team at even 100 person, 200, 300 and up company, especially nowadays, there's a ton of interest for data, which I always say, I love all of the interest for data, right? That's what keeps me employed. That's what keeps you indirectly employed. It's great. But I think it's easy to get overwhelmed. And again, really all of the data people that I've worked with are genuinely nice people that want to make their coworkers happy, right? And I think we all feel that way. But I think it's too easy to get into that mode again of doing work of different values and different ROI because you want to give everyone a little bit of data time and you want to be nice and help everyone out. Unfortunately, data teams, like many other teams and organizations, have to really prioritize ruthlessly and focus on let's make sure we're aligned with the company goals. Let's make sure we are driving impact in the ways that we can. And let's make sure we're focusing on a concise set of things so that we're not spread too thinly.
Is there a way that you would approach that? Let's say when you start in a new role, do you have sort of like a playbook for how to figure out like what are the priorities? And, you mentioned wanting to deliver data might be to like 5, 6, 10 different teams. Do you have sort of like a go-to method for figuring out who those people might be and coming up with some framework for how to divide your time amongst those stakeholders?
It's a great question. Also a great interview question that I get sometimes. I think prioritization is one of those questions like, how do you make a sandwich? Which is to say there are a lot of answers to it. My best answer at this point in my career is spend a lot of time talking to people, right? And really spend a lot of time talking to all of the different leaders and functional heads when you're joining a role. To me, there's usually two lists. There's a list of what that particular leader or what that particular team wants to get from the data team. And then there's a list of what are your team's top priorities right now, or for this quarter, or for this month, right? And often what I find is those two lists aren't fully aligned. And so I think one of the really important roles of a data team is to really be translators and take that list of, okay, what's important for your team, and actually translate that into, okay, now what are the actions that the data team is going to take? So I try to get that first list of what's important to you this quarter, what's important to you this year, rather than what data do you want to look at? And I often say to people, I will do that translation. I'm happy to do it. It's part of my job, or it's part of my team's job. That helps to do that business alignment because you now know, okay, these are the things this team is going for, rather than just the data they're looking for.
You mentioned what's important this quarter, what's important this year, and that reminded me of a framework that I was given by a product management mentor of mine a few years ago, which was to think about things in terms of, I think he referred to it as hills and mountains, and the idea was like, what are the hills that you have ahead of you? So that would be things that like you need to accomplish on a weekly basis, or things that need to happen on a monthly basis. So as a data team, that might be, hey, we need to do a check-in on like our data model. Like, is the data model okay right now? And that needs to be like a recurring conversation versus the mountain type goals are a much longer term thing that you have to push towards. So that's a really interesting framework that you proposed there. A new leader could use that framework in communicating back to leadership and say, hey, these are the things that sounds like matter on a quarterly basis. These are the things that sound like they matter on like an annual basis, or like even longer term than that. Is that right?
Absolutely. And I think not only when you join a role, right? I think like a lot of other teams, again, at organizations, data teams should be doing their own quarterly road mapping to really understand, okay, again, we're going to take all of this inbound, we're going to take the top level business initiatives, and then we're going to take the things that we need to be working on that are coming from the team, whether that's data model, data quality, data pipelines, observability, you name it, right? And we're going to synthesize all of that into something that we can socialize and communicate with other teams to make sure everybody understands, okay, here's what the data team is working on this quarter. And I think that really helps with that second piece of focusing on a few things. The end result of that is telling people no. One of my discoveries is on the data side, it's much easier to tell people no if they know what the organization is getting instead, right? If you just tell them no, those are hard conversations. They're much easier if you say, well, we're not going to work on this for your particular team, but hey, we're doing this shiny, cool thing for another team. Always a much easier conversation.
Got it. That's super interesting. Maybe we can change gears a little bit because I think we've talked a little bit about building the team, or like what it's like coming into a new team and having those conversations with stakeholders. What about building the team? So specifically when you're going out and you're hiring data engineers, or you're hiring data scientists, or any other role that you would staff on a data team, what are you looking for?
I think a lot of people talk about the individuals or data professionals on their teams as being T-shaped, and I certainly subscribe to that. Really having people who have a broad range of experience across the data space, anything from data engineering, analytics, data science, visualization, machine learning, AI, at sort of the other end of the spectrum, I think, from data pipelines. And so I think it's really important to have people who can work across some chunk of that spectrum. I think there's very few people who can work across all of that, from neural nets to deep data pipeline work, but having some cross-section of that. And then ideally people who have some depth in at least one of those areas, right? Maybe it's business data science, maybe it's data engineering, maybe it's ML modeling. And then really looking for what's the right combination of those different T's such that you end up getting good depth across different parts of the spectrum, or you get that depth in the places that you need.
So does that mean that then kind of as you hire the team, you're keeping track in your mind of like, cool, like where am I filling in those sort of deep parts of the T around my team? And are you planning your next hire based on the composition of those current specializations that you've sort of already put together?
It depends. I would say sometimes yes. I think it also depends on whether sometimes you're coming into a team already and there's a small number of incremental hires that you're making. And sometimes you need generalists, or sometimes you have a specific need in mind for those people. So it really honestly depends on where the existing team falls along that T.
And maybe sort of related to that, when you are thinking about that T, or when you're sort of in the earlier stages of looking for someone to join the team, how early do you feel you're able to identify that? Or do you have any specific techniques for looking for what is that sort of deep part of this T-shaped person that you put into your hiring process?
I would love to be able to say that I can identify it early on. I think the reality is that we all know now that hiring processes are very random in many ways and often biased in some ways. For me, it's very broad bucketing, right? It's, this person has deeper experience on, it's probably those 5 or 6 buckets I mentioned initially, right? Data engineering or ML or analytics and data science. I think those broad buckets are visible from pretty early conversations because the buckets are so broad, but it's not, I generally don't get deeper than that, right? It's not usually, okay, I'm looking for depth in neural net ML models, right? I think unless you have a very specific need or you're in a very specific environment where you need those roles.
And just for context, I might know a little bit more than some folks watching about the types of teams you've been on in your background, but maybe to add context to that answer, are we talking about like a specific, like specialized data team within a 10,000 person company, or what types of teams and what types of company sizes are you talking about when you answer that?
A lot of my career has been spent building fairly broad scope data teams at smaller organizations. So usually 75 to a few hundred people. And so in those roles, the types of data teams that I look for and look to build are very broad scope, covering analytics, data science, and ideally data engineering as well. And because of the size of the companies, right, there isn't a lot of that specialization. That's why I think that breadth is important, because data teams get all kinds of really interesting questions. And it's important to have data professionals who have good breadth, who can answer questions, maybe even if it's a little outside of their particular deep expertise or their comfort zone. I think you'll notice the thing I didn't mention at all is really specific backgrounds or specific skill sets. My background is economics and public policy. I sort of fell into data science and analytics kind of accidentally, which I think is a pretty common story for a lot of people, actually. And I've worked with really incredible data professionals from all kinds of backgrounds and with all kinds of skill sets. And so for me, it's really about, are people quantitative and can they break down a problem thoughtfully, rather than can they break down that problem thoughtfully in Java or Ruby or Python or something specific like that, right? I think there's certainly a skills component of, okay, does this person have the right skills across, whether that's SQL, Python, R, Excel, great data analysis tool. Does this person have the skills to interact with the data and actually do the things they need to with it? But beyond that, I don't have very strong preferences on backgrounds or skill sets. And would encourage everyone to cast a broad net in their data hiring practices.
I've talked about this before with other folks that have been on the show. I'm on the side of building tools for data teams, and even what's shaping the vendor landscape as well is that I feel like data is fairly unique because it's a lot of software engineering work that has to actually happen, but it's being done by people from physics backgrounds, statistics backgrounds.
Totally.
Economics, et cetera. And that seems like it's a fundamentally different thing. I mean, not that those folks don't also exist in sort of more traditional software engineering roles, but that seems to be a defining characteristic of data teams a lot of the time.
Absolutely. And I think it's frankly great.
So going back to it, so let's say you're one of these folks that's looking to join a data team. What do you think they should be looking out for?
One of the things that's really fascinating to me is that data science has been a job title for quite a while now, right? Probably a decade at least. And there's still not a lot of specificity around what it is. Data science is a very broad job title that can include things like building visualizations, experimentation, building actual ML models, and simple analysis in SQL or things like Excel, right? So it's a very broad job title. One of the things I think that's really important is understanding what data science or analytics or data engineering mean to particular companies and what the scope of the role is, and making sure that that scope aligns with what you're looking to do, right? I think sometimes people say, I want to be a data scientist. I want to spend 90% of my time building ML models. Great. That is absolutely a thing many data scientists do, but I think is less likely to be true at small companies where there isn't as much of a focus on ML modeling. So just making sure there's a good fit in terms of what you as a prospective data professional are looking to do and what the company is asking of its data team. Going back to the business impact bingo card is making sure that the team is structured and leveled in a way that it can have that business impact. This is a rant that I have given to several people, and I'll give to you as well, which is I'm constantly really surprised at larger organizations hiring data teams that are siloed or underleveled. I think that's really detrimental to data teams having business impact. So my advice for people going into new data roles is make sure that data is placed in the organization in a way that it can align with the organization. Oftentimes you see data siloed in product, ops, finance, really pretty much every team, right? Sometimes you'll see a data team silo. And I think it's really important to understand what the through lines look like to higher level leaders or to other teams in the business in that situation. I think ideally data teams should be a top level team, which I'm happy to rant about more too. But making sure that the team isn't so siloed that it's difficult to have that impact. And I think the other thing is to make sure that your own personal level, as well as the level of actually the data person that you'll be working with that's leading the team, are aligned with the size of the company. I think you see a lot, 300, 400, 500 person companies, they have VP or senior VP level leaders for sales, marketing, engineering, product design, operations, et cetera. And then they say, data is really important to us. We're going to hire a senior data scientist. I always find that very interesting because ultimately, what has happened in every instance where I've seen that is that senior data scientist who maybe a few years into their career, their peers are people with 15 years of industry experience. To me, there's a leveling mismatch in those situations. And I think that can, one, make it hard to really have that, hard to get things done and hard to have that business impact. It feels like there's that mismatch there. And I think can also mean that companies don't want to invest as much in their data teams as they should because they say, well, we're not ready for a bigger team, or we're not ready to bring someone in at a higher level within the organization because of the cost or the complexity that entails. And to me, that's not a red flag necessarily, but an area where people should really ask questions to understand how the data team works with the rest of the organization and what the vision for the data team is, or if you're the person that's being asked to provide that vision, making sure that you can execute on it.
So if I could repeat a few of the things that I heard. So one is understanding, especially as an individual practitioner, if you're coming in and you're saying like, hey, I really want to do a bunch of analytics modeling, making sure that that's actually something that the team is there to do and that that's on their roadmap. Or like
Absolutely.
you said, if I'm coming in to do some ML work, make sure that that is actually on the docket. Don't assume. Second one that I heard was, where is the data team within the organization? You mentioned through lines up to leadership. So does the data team eventually roll into the CTO? Does the data team eventually roll into the CFO? I think that sounds like there's a question there about like, where do we live within the org? Is that changing? And understanding sort of like where that placement is.
Because I think that also goes to alignment for the role, right? If you're really interested in product data science and the data org rolls up to the CFO, oftentimes there's a misalignment there.
And then the third one you mentioned sounded like it kind of had to do with funding, which is like, where is the data team coming in terms of the company's lifespan? Is that appropriate? If the company's gotten quite far and they're just now investing in data, the data team might be doing a lot of backlog work, or they might be having to implement sort of cultural change within the company because the company may not have had data at all up until this point. So understanding where is the data team in terms of company maturity?
Absolutely. I think another way to phrase it might be, how's the company setting the data team up for success? Are they making sure it's the right size, the right composition, the right level of leadership, et cetera?
Okay. And then that's probably a good segue into one of the last questions that I had for you today, which is if you were to talk to founders or anybody who's sort of like in that executive position where they are deciding whether or not it's time to invest in a data team, what would you tell them about how to identify when is the right time and how to go about it?
I love this question. My answer is always you should start a data team yesterday, and it should be a top level team reporting into one of the leaders of the organization, right? Could be a CEO, could be a CFO, could be a COO. I think that does depend a little bit on the organization, but yeah, to me, the ideal data team is one that is started early, is a high-level team that reports to a C-level executive, and also has representation at the sort of staff level on an equal footing with other functional heads, right? So I think about it really as a separate function. And I think it's really important to start a data team or have a data professional who either has some leadership experience or can grow into that early on, because I think there's just so much that having data people at your company can do early on, right? Whether it's establishing metrics and what the company should be measuring and thinking about and then computing those metrics. A big one for me is working with engineers on instrumentation and data collection in almost an engineering adjacent function to make sure as the company grows that you have the right foundations for doing later analysis. And then obviously, depending on how much advanced analytics work or ML work is based on the product, also really important to have people with that skill set early on, right? But I think it's really important to treat it as a separate function so that there's enough time and enough resourcing for it, right? A lot of times you see data pipelines or data systems built by other quantitative people, right? Engineers, finance people, marketers who are quantitative and do a great job, but are juggling that with some of their other roles. And frankly, I think it's really hard to juggle data roles and even subspecializations of data, right? Data science, data engineering, ML. It's hard to juggle multiple of those things, even in a small company.
So if we had to draw a line in the sand where 100 folks that are in software engineering, finance, marketing, sales, legal, when you don't have a data team yet, you should probably be asking questions. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, I think absolutely. I think that is a little late to the game. It's not as if it's 200, then it's very late to the game. I think earlier is better so that the data team can grow with the company. Right? Again, I think about data as any other function. If you talk to a 300-person company and they said, well, we haven't hired a sales team yet, people would have a lot of questions, and rightly so. But that's a very common, I think it's changing, which is great. But I think that's still a very common thing where you have big companies who truly feel that data is important, that wait to hire data teams. And it's really hard to play catch up in those situations.
All right. So I want to turn it over to our rapid fire questions to wrap up before we break. Right. I think that was a ton of valuable information for anybody who's getting started on a data team or thinking about making one. But maybe we can do some fun stuff too. So
let's do it.
All right. Question number one, favorite statistical technique?
There's so many good ones to pick from. I'm going to go with the good old t-test because I still think it's easy. There's a lot of value. It's available everywhere and in a lot of formats. My favorite thing about the t-test is it actually imposes organizational process around experimentation by adding some context around sample sizing. And so I love that you get not only a statistical test, but also organizational process pointers from it.
All right. The good old t-test is a classic. How about second question, iPhone or Android?
I personally am an Android user. Essentially every other device I have used, whether computer, tablet, mobile phone, for the past, 15 years has been a Mac, right? I'm a long time Mac user, even going back to before Apple was cool. And so I think it's great to have some competition in this space and great to have options for mobile devices and not just a single player.
Okay. Third one, last rapid fire question. Analyst as a job title, underrated or not?
I love this question. I spent a lot of time talking to people about this one. So I'll try to give a mostly rapid fire answer. So I'm a really big fan of data science job title to describe almost all work that quantitative professionals do. And I think, frankly, you've seen a lot of bigger companies move towards using that job title as well. The reason that I really like it is because I think even in broad data roles, right? I think people are often asked to do data science work. Going back to first rapid fire, that could be things like t-tests, right? Or Bayesian statistics. And I truly do consider those data science work, even if they're not necessarily building ML models, right? Data sets for feature extraction for models, right? That's data science work, even if you're not necessarily building the model. And so I think there's just so much. I think sometimes data teams don't give themselves enough credit for the quantitative nature of the work that they're doing. And so I'm really big fan of the data science title. I also think it's really important for organizations to align on one or the other, because I think in organizations where there's a mix of those job titles, it in some ways imposes potentially some value judgment on the different types of work, which I don't know that that's intentional, but I think sometimes it can feel that way, right? And often, even for things like recruiting, for things like internal advancement and promotions, just brings up a lot of second order questions, right? So if you're talking to someone who's a data analyst, they say, well, I really want that data science job title. I think that reflects the work I do. Why am I in this other job title? And frankly, I don't think a lot of companies have great answers to that. So I'm data science all the way.
All right. Well, Justin, thanks so much for being on the Observatory today and answering all these great questions, especially for folks that are either starting data or analytics teams, or maybe they're managing or growing them right now. Justin joins us from Nearside today. Nearside is a company that's building the world's best small business banking platform. If you want to learn more about it, you can check out a link in the description below. Justin, thanks for being on the Observatory.
This was a ton of fun. Thank you very much for having me.
All right. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.